The last process that takes place in the eye that you need to learn is the process called pupillary mechanism. So pupillary mechanism is the process by which the pupil gets either larger or smaller depending on the amount of light entering the eye. So just remember that this is the pupil, the black hole in the middle of the iris. This is the iris all the way around, so your iris might be brown or green, but this iris has muscles in it which control the size of the pupil. The pupil is just a hole. The iris is the object with muscles in it to change the size of that hole. So the process, simply stated, is the pupil will dilate or constrict to adjust for the amount of light entering the eye. So dilate means get bigger. If you think of a woman going into labor, her cervix dilates, means gets bigger, to allow for the baby to come through. And that would happen if we're dealing with dim light. So in dim light, the pupil will dilate because now there's not a lot of light in the room and you want this pupil to get much bigger to allow more light to enter the eye so you can see clearly. Whereas in bright light, the pupil will constrict, which means get smaller, so that less light enters the eye. And that's to protect your retina from essentially being blinded or burnt by very bright light rays by allowing too much light in. You've all experienced that feeling where you've been sleeping, for example, and someone walks in and turns the light on or opens the curtains very wide and your eyes feel like, what's going on? That's exactly what happens. It's because you've been sleeping, so your eyelids have been closed, so it's counted as dim light, and your pupil will be very dilated. And when someone opens the curtains, the bright light comes in and your pupil is too dilated, and that then causes that feeling of seeing stars or seeing spots. And then your pupil will constrict. You can try that looking in a mirror, covering your eyes and closing them, and then opening your eyes and uncovering them, looking in the mirror, and you will see that your pupil goes from being dilated to constricted as it's exposed to more light. So let's look at how this happens. So the first thing we must look at is the two different types of muscles in the iris. So you have some that make concentric circles, so circles within circles. So these are what we call circular muscles. And this is of the iris. So this is the colored part of your eye. So yours might be brown, this one's blue, but yours might be green, whatever. But this is not to be confused with the ciliary body that has ciliary muscles, which is used for accommodation. These are circular muscles of the iris. So they form circles. You can see them on this side as well. Many more circles visible here. Now, these circular muscles of the iris work antagonistically, so oppositely, to the radial muscles of the iris. So if you remember antagonistic muscles from grade 10, if the bicep contracts, the tricep will relax. So the same thing happens for these. If the circular muscles contract, the radial muscles will relax. So just like with accommodation, the circular muscles are a sphincter. So when they contract, they move inwards, they close inwards, closing the hole, which is the pupil. So I always try to remember the circular muscles working first, but also, as you can see, we know that when a muscle contracts, it will get shorter. If it relaxes, it gets longer. Circular muscles are circular shaped, so that's a little bit difficult to think of. But you can see the radial muscles here get longer, and that's what happens when they relax. So let's have a look at how we state this. You could be given a photo, you could be given data about the pupil size changing, but in response to light being moved closer or further away. But you need to always name that the iris has the muscles. So at some point, you've got to say in your answer, the iris contains circular and radial muscles. Then you don't need to say this part twice. So when there is bright light, we know that your pupil will get smaller to minimize the amount of light coming in the eye. So your radial muscles will relax and therefore lengthen. You can see here they're longer than in this photo. Your circular muscles will contract, which closes the sphincter, which is your pupil. So there's the circular muscles contracting, which causes the pupil to constrict, mean get smaller. So you could also say, if you don't want to learn the term constrict, the pupil gets smaller. That's also acceptable to say. And then that causes less light to enter the eye. And it's the exact opposite for dim light. So again, you can learn one scenario really well and just learn that it's the opposite for the other type of light. So for dim light, the radial muscles will contract, which is essentially, if you think about it, they're attached onto the edge of the iris here. If all of them contract, they're pulling that hole open. It's like ripping open a packet of chips, and you open that hole at the top of the packet of chips. So they contract, pulling open the pupil. The circular muscles of the iris will relax. The pupil will dilate, or you can say get bigger or get wider. The pupil widens, and therefore more light enters the eye. So these are the opposite terms to the other side. So something to note, you don't have to say radial muscles before circular. On either side, you can say circular first because they actually happen at the same time. They happen antagonistically, like I said. So they work in opposition, so they work together. So it could be one sentence saying radial muscle of the iris relax while the circular muscle of the iris contract, and it could be done in a vice versa fashion. So like I said, with accommodation, with pupillary mechanism, learn one scenario that makes sense to you in the most detailed way possible. Then you know you can do a shorthand saying radial muscles contract, circular muscles relax. But you know they're in the iris. You must always say they're in the iris. Pupil dilates, more light enters the eye. And then if we ask you in an exam on the opposite scenario, you know that it's the opposite to what you've learned, and you just change all of the adjectives that you have studied.